you.
The chairman of the exam, 3 or 4?
3 chairmen and 7 examining and 3 chairmen. Seems like a long time.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome Sheila O'Donnell and John Tuomey to the AA. Both Sheila and John are friends of the AA. John having spent 7 years as one of our external examiners. And in fact, he was the chairman of the external examiners for 3 of those 7 years. We were first introduced to the work of Sheila O'Donnell and John Tuomey in 1986 when they had an exhibition which was part of a series called Figurative Architecture, the work of 5 Dublin architects, in which it also included a preliminary scheme for the Irish Film Centre. The work of Sheila O'Donnell and John Tuomey is very much committed to the continuity of the traditions of modernism, but at the same time works very much with the mediation with local situations, both urban locations and rural landscapes as well as being very specific in terms of the utilization of materials, as well as and also the whole question of utilization of colors and textures as a way of revising the whole tradition of modernism, which I think is a very interesting aspect of the way they work together. Sheila and John, with a group of colleagues, formed Group 91 in 1988 to make strategic propositions in Temple Bar, Dublin's new cultural quarter, and these careful interventions have undoubtedly made a vital contribution to the life of the city. Their lecture tonight, entitled Constructed Landscapes and Cityscapes, addresses their preoccupations of urban design and the cultural role of the architect in the city and the importance of the relationship of buildings to landscape, focusing on their recent projects located in the Irish countryside. O'Donnell and Tuomey architects are studio lecturers at UCD Dublin and have been visiting critics in the United States, at the GSD and other places, as well as in the United Kingdom. Their work has been widely published and exhibited, and they were awarded the Architectural Association of Ireland the Downs Medal in 1988, 1990, and 1992. Would you please join me in welcoming Sheila O'Donnell and John Tuomey?
Thank you very much. We will speak about 2 aspects of our work this evening: the work we've been doing in the city and the work we've been looking at in the landscape. And we'll show you some of the work that we're engaged on currently, which is work that's not quite cooked yet, as well as bringing you through a little quick tour of the principal preoccupations of our practice. So if we can start with the slides, we will show 2 projects as a sort of introduction, which Sheila and I will show you, and then we'll spend about half an hour each bringing you through these 2 aspects of our work. So I start by showing the Irish Pavilion, which was a curious project for us, which was built here in the courtyard, in the courtyard of the new Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, constructed there in 1991. It had already been constructed in the Netherlands as a temporary exhibition pavilion in an obscure exhibition of Northern European art and architecture. But for us, this pavilion was an important project, and we show it by way of introduction. It was important for a variety of reasons. It was a very specific project as a collaboration with an artist, painter Brian Maguire, who's a painter of our generation in Ireland. And we had to make the pavilion around 12 of his paintings. So in one way we had to make a house for his work. We had to make a house for his... we had to treat his psyche as the context of the work, so to speak. And out of that we had to make a building or a form that carried the character of his work, but that also spoke about our own preoccupations in architecture. And the plan of this project and the movement through it in 3 dimensions, and its character as a barn or as a studio or as a temple or as a simple house were very important to us in the development of the project, the sense of it as a sort of pavilion or island building. It had a open interior. It had no doors, no enclosure. It was just an open pavilion. So you walked into it like you would into any shed. And inside it had some specific installations which were related to the themes and topics of his paintings. Externally, it had a different expression. It sat within the formal early 18th century context of the former hospital, military hospital in Kilmainham. It sat in that courtyard like it was described as like a crouched cat sitting there. The painter thought of it as a Trojan horse. We thought of it because we had both worked with Jim Sterling in the late 70s. And Sterling used to always describe his Olivetti Hazelmere as 2 badly parked London buses. So we thought of this as one badly parked London bus in the courtyard, and we wanted it to be installed in the courtyard in a way that spoke about its removal as well as its temporary, its evanescent location. We got very interested in the fact that it had to be put together, built in Ireland, then shipped to the Netherlands, then brought back, then re-erected, and then eventually taken away. So it was made in timber to be all taken down into parts that had to fit into a truck. And we got very interested in the making of it, in the idea that the character or emotional space of the building was directly defined by the materials of its construction. So sometimes we expose it as the studwork frame that it is. Sometimes we skin it where we have to exhibit the work. A big dispute between ourselves and the painter was the extent of shadows in the space. So we had to come to a compromise where the shadows were one thing in the space and the paintings were lit independently. Brian Maguire took the view that if he wanted a shadow in his painting, he would have painted it in his painting. We took the view that his paintings were all a shadowy world. And we tried to move from outside through some threshold space to inside by changing the character and definition, even the acoustic of the space as you went through it. It lasted it was built for 6 weeks. This project we worked on for 2 years. There are lots and lots of drawings. It took an awful lot of carpenters a very long time to make it. And it lasted 6 weeks in the courtyard. It was just an architect doesn't often get that feeling of their work being a temporary exhibition, I suppose, especially as this was built as a building. And after 6 weeks, it was gone in a day, with just a wet patch on the gravel in the courtyard left. And we were as interested by what it gave us. I mean, it took a lot out of our energies, but it also gave us a kind of new idea about what we might aspire to in our expectations of the emotional charge of a piece of architecture. And it was the beginning of our interest in timber construction.
This second part of the introduction is about the Irish Film Centre, which, while it shares some of the preoccupations John has been describing in the pavilion, is very different in the fact that it's in an extremely specific and very congested urban location, and therefore its context is very real, and rather than being a psyche of an artist, it's a part of the relatively intact historic city centre of Dublin. On the map on your right, you can see the coloured image is the plan of the film centre, which occupies the former Quaker headquarters in the Temple Bar area of Dublin. We started working on this building at a time when the now kind of fairly well-known Temple Bar project hadn't yet been conceived. And this was to be just a one-off building in an area adjacent to a huge bus station which was about to be built on the site. The building is very much an interior of a block with very small fragments of building coming out to three different streets with an entrance here, here and here. The slide on the left is a photograph of the one new facade which the building has, which was the archive and office part of the film centre, which is this narrow brick building. And this slide really is to give a sense of the character of that part of Dublin City and the context in which a lot of our work is based. And in a way, I suppose the plan shows something about our interest in trying to make space and make a kind of architecture which is very much dependent on and supportive of the historic city. Sorry, what happened there? Oh. Hold on now, I've got to... Sorry. No. Let's get this right. The photograph on the left is the part of the existing building, the Quaker headquarters, and it gives a sense of the physical reality with which we were working, which was a really strong aspect of working on this project, was that we were working in very tiny spaces, trying on the one hand to transform an existing institution and on the other hand to make some new installations or parts of buildings and architecture within gaps and spaces between the existing buildings. These two photographs, one are both of the site works. The one on the right shows the main new space that we've made in the building, which is really almost like discovering or carving out a public space in an existing city block. And the yellow wall is a yellow render that we made to make this new facade. The building has really very little public facade, so we made a facade within the block, within the old building, which we finished with this yellow ochre coloured render. And because we were using an ochre powder which was mixed into the render, the wall had to be plastered in one day, in one go, because we couldn't keep the colour or make a mixture twice. So there was an amazing sense of activity on the site of plasterers working in a line down the wall, trying to get the colour and the texture of the plaster right, and the feeling of yellow powder in the air, which in a way is sort of mirrored in the sense of the old building on the photograph on the left. What we found in working in this kind of very dense context, where there was a lot of existing walls and floor surfaces and textures, is we got very interested in the idea of surface and how surface would define and give spirit or character to a space. And these photographs are of the yellow render, which I've already described, using the ochre pigment, and some smaller elements in the space used a cobalt blue pigment. And what we found was that the cobalt is extremely expensive and ochre is very cheap, so we used the cobalt in very small areas in a very smooth finishing plaster as a surface coating, which is almost like a polished render. And the yellow, which is cheap, is used in large areas in a sand and cement render, which is, it was kind of an interesting study of thinking about materials and colour and the sort of physical, there was like sacks of pure colour, and that the cobalt comes in bags and the ochre comes in sacks because of the relative cost of the two materials. And we were very interested in using these materials and other steel and stone to give a kind of character and overlay on the existing spaces. On the left is a model that we made, which was a model made in plaster, which studies the different, or made in plaster and wood and glass and steel, studying really the floor surfaces that we wanted to make on the sequence from the entrance on the street through into the foyer, which is the main public space of the building, and out to another exit here. And we studied how these the character and colour of the materials, which we wanted the space in some way to be defined by the floors, that as you walked through you had a sense of walking on glass with light underneath at the entrance, and then coming into the stone circle, which gives a kind of focus, and the black concrete around the edge, which defines the space. On the right, I suppose, is just the sense of this, the new space in the centre of the old block, keeping the old walls and trying to make the new roof as light as possible so that you would still have a sense of what it was like before with the overlay of the new. And then the drawing on the left shows the series of new buildings that were inserted within the existing building. And this drawing abstracts those elements of the facade of the archive and office building, the projection box for the 2 cinemas in the film centre, which is on top of a portico entrance at the back, and then the yellow curved wall here, which houses all the public service counters of the reception and ticket offices, the restaurant and bar above, and then the director's office above that. Again, this is really a description of the materials, and of the use of neon was another material which we used in the building. We were very concerned to think about what the spirit of the building ought to be, and the existing building had a very strong spirit and character, but we wanted it to have an overlay of the contemporary art of cinema, and the sense that a new use was occupying an old building. And light, the use of light, both natural and artificial, were really important in the building in terms of defining spaces that were the cinemas had no daylight, the spaces that were the public space were very strongly daylit, and then the use of the neon, which was a kind of reference to traditional cinemas of the 20s and 30s, but we wanted to use it in a more abstract way to define spaces and to indicate directions of movement. And the view on the right is as you walk down the narrow street at the side of the building, that really through a kind of gap beside a fire escape you get a glimpse of the building, and it's the small outdoor space that we've made with the projection box behind in the stone wall. And this, I suppose, is a way of how we find we're working in the city in spaces which are almost stolen from between gaps in existing buildings in narrow spaces. And we're very interested in trying to make a sense of the new layered beside or behind the old buildings. These photographs are both about the use of glass and stone. On the left, the glass floor light as you walk in and how it's cut into the stone. And on the right, the projection box, which has this one vertical window, which is a window and a roof light, which is on the axis of the main cinema, so that people walking by at night might see the flickering light of the projection box and have some idea of the building in use and how it's used.
In 1991, Dublin was nominated as European Capital of Culture, and we had been involved for the last decade, for the decade of the 80s, with colleagues of our generation in Dublin in a series of counter projects against development that were taking place all over the city. Destruction and neglect and vandalism of speculative development. So when 1991 was looming, we thought that in the year before, it wasn't quite, Moisen in his introduction said that we'd started this project in 88, but actually we started working together in 88, and it wasn't until coming up to this project that we joined with our colleagues in this group, what we call Group 91, called 91 in preparation for the Year of Culture, and we thought it would be an exciting idea to make a built exhibition of a modest proposal for simply living over the shop, living in the city. And by some fluke, we persuaded the corporation in Dublin to give us a site, and they gave us this site in the Liberties in the centre of the medieval city, which they had no use for because they had just demolished 5-story tenement buildings on it, and they had their only proposal at the moment is two-story cul-de-sac housing, and they had no proposal for housing that would cope with the vertical scale. So they gave it to us to make of what we would, and then we had a site, and then we had to go together to make a project. There were 8 members in Group 91, and the site had to be subdivided, which we did on the basis of equal division of plots. So if you were on a short plot, you got a wide width, and if you were on a long plot, you got a narrow width. And then we have the site sliced into plots, and Sheila and I were allocated plot 3, which is one of the 9-metre wide plots. we interpreted it to think of imagining it as a big house, a house on the pattern of the Georgian houses in the city. And we tried to look at the idea of that's the wrong one, isn't it? So now I need to go back here. No, now I need to go back this way. We were looking at the idea of the Georgian house. If you look at a Georgian house in Dublin, the hierarchy of the house is completely legible on its elevation, the social hierarchy of the house. And also, I suppose, the functions of the rooms with the service in the basement, the kitchen in the basement, deliveries to the basement, the reception and entry up steps and in the main door on the ground floor, the piano nobile on the first floor, and bedrooms, and then the staff accommodation and nurseries under the attic. Interestingly, those houses which are so fixed in their form have turned out to be the most flexible buildings that we have in the city. They're used for every kind of function. Whereas the buildings that are designed to be flexible, like the 60s office blocks, which are neutral in their form, turn out now to be the most inflexible set of buildings that we have, and there's not much can be done with them except that for which they were designed. So we were looking to make that strongly fixed or characterized form, but reassemble it to accommodate the change of use patterns and change of life and so we made each apartment interlocking with high living rooms, small bedrooms, daylit kitchens, and a series of communal spaces that would give variety and scale to the pattern of daily life. We assembled this strategy of the cross-section produces a kind of another kind of elevation, and then we became interested simply in the weight of the elevation and in the presence of the brick and the modelling of the elevation. Come 1991, sure enough, Dublin is the culture capital of Europe, but there was nobody with any money to spend on anything, and the market shifted, and it was during one of those times when it was more valuable to have your money in money than it was to have it in buildings, and so this project stayed on paper. The value of it was that it collected a group of people who sort of ganged together to do one thing, and like any committee that's set up, the next thing you think of is, well, how do we stay together to do the next thing? And so we looked at this area of Temple Bar and decided that instead of working on the site that the corporation had given us, we should approach Temple Bar. In the meantime, Sheila and I kept doing unsuccessful entries to competitions, trying to eke out every last drop of life out of the proposal for the elevations that we had made. We entered the competition because we had the Group 91 assembled. We entered the competition for Temple Bar in 1991 as a group. And Temple Bar as an area of Dublin, has a very diverse character. Let me just see if I can light up. This is the River Liffey. This is the River Liffey. This is Trinity College at this end, and this is just off the map there is Christchurch, the medieval cathedral at the other. So the area that's known as Temple Bar extends down Dane Street, past Trinity College, down to the River Liffey and back. It's that kind of core of unchanged urban configuration in the centre of Dublin. The film centre, which you saw earlier, is located right there. That would be on the red spot is the glass roof of the film centre. And so we're already working in this area, but we made this plan with our colleagues, which came out of the diversity and scale of Temple Bar and the fact that we were a loose group of individual architects. So we had no one single big idea to change Temple Bar. I think the other people in the competition were mainly, by and large, were the kind of corporate practice element of Irish architecture, and they were coming in with a big idea. And because we thought the big idea for Temple Bar is already existing in its streets and in its configuration. And so we just made a proposal that would emphasize public space and public life in the city. One particular aspect of that proposal was a piece that we had worked on ourselves, which that's the main cinema of the film centre. This is the River Liffey. And we made the proposal to link one of the streets north-south across the Liffey through the wall of the quays and into a new square behind the Quaker Meeting House, which became then known as Meeting House Square, and that square would become the centre of the cultural quarter of Temple Bar. We did an experiment in the early days of outdoor cinema. This is the wall, this is the old projector box of the Irish Film Centre, which we finished in about the time actually, in 1991-92. And we did some external film shows to see whether we could actually make a serious proposition about public space and its use. And we ran a very civilized short season of outdoor cinema during which the weather cooperated and people sat outside with the blankets over their knees just like they do in Venice. And the government and the state agencies were persuaded that we could have such a space in Dublin. So our cartoon in the competition for the space, this one, was an idea about a public room that would have sometimes cinema projection and sometimes a theatre performance, and would be a place for cultural expression and cultural life in the city. The building that we've just completed, or that we should have just completed, but contractors prevent us from completing it in time for the AA lecture at least, is the National Photography Centre, which comes straight out of this cartoon. It was clear that we were interested in the idea of performance, projection, and so we wrote the brief together with the agency, state agency who are developing Temple Bar. We wrote the brief for the use, which is to take the National Photography Archive, that's in those 3 stories of that building, which is all the glass plate negative collection of the early historical history of photography in Ireland. Then to take a College of Photography, professional photography, which is on those 3 floors there. These are the studios and these are the teaching rooms. And to combine the archive and the school into a building where the students could curate the archive in the basement and the archivists could participate in the teaching of the school program. And then across the square, on the wall here where we had just thought about a cafe or something, across the square we make a proposal for a gallery of photography, contemporary photography, which already existed in Temple Bar in a small warehouse building. The gallery is on the first floor, its entrance and shop are on the ground floor, and dark rooms in the basement. And it has a screen, a window screen, like a camera has a lens, and you can project images across the square from one to the other. So the archive school building is shown in this cutaway, where you see its ground floor archive entered through the arch. You see its top floor studios for the College of Photography with the dark rooms sort of plugged on the top. And on the other drawing you see the facade of the Gallery of Photography removed like a mask, and you see the interior complexity of the organization behind a single face. There's a roof garden for public resort on the top of the building. We were trying to make this public space, which comes into use now in April, ready for the summer of this year. It becomes a symbolic space in Dublin political life because the European Union presidency comes back to Dublin in July, and so the clients want to have this space as a sort of celebration space of all of the European investment that's happened in the restructuring of Temple Bar. So that's a deadline for us to finish this building, which is even more significant than the AA lecture tonight for us, and is also more likely that we make that target. The intimacy of the project for Sheila and myself is that we started in this block in 1987 with the Film Centre and thinking about film, and that we had the opportunity then to extend that by making public space and by extending the series of buildings all to do with the projected image. On the first floor of the archive building, there's a little projector box which can shine these images across the square, and you can have cinema on the face of the building. So from the building, which is here and it's sort of just emerged from scaffolding kind of form, this is the little projector box. This is the accommodation for the archive that has a basement store below. These are the little teaching rooms for the College of Photography. And these are the blinded windows of the photography studios that have their ventilation and darkrooms overhead. The extraordinary problem about this project is that photographers want no daylight when they're like this, when they're lecturing. They want no daylight when they're working in their darkrooms. They want no daylight in the studios because when they want daylight they go outside for an outdoor shoot, so they always want artificial light in the studio. And they can't have any daylight in the exhibition space because it doesn't allow them to take archival photographs into exhibition. And there's no daylight allowed in the archive store. So 90% of the rooms in this building are briefed to have no window whatsoever. And it's in the most significant urban location, pivotally within the centre of Temple Bar. So it's a blinded palazzo. It's a warehouse for photography, but everywhere you look, there's a rarity of daylight within, and so you're completely working with the idea of the physical presence and bulk of the building. So we use zinc plate, zinc sheet, to make some analogy with the photographic process. And we used weight and massiveness in the brickwork to establish the building, which couldn't have any transparency. On the upper floor plan of the archive, you see the long studio that cuts through the length of the plan, and these big boxes that take sliding screens that can subdivide the studio. So it's another curious aspect of reality, that we thought of this project as a big stop end to street that comes down, that you'll see in a second, that it comes down right into. But then the building directly in front of us, which is a little two-story shop, became listed and had to be kept, preserved. It's like somebody having left something just right here in front of you, and which you never intended to be permanent, but people get very fond of these buildings, and then you find your building is in a lane, and its facade, which you think of as being a great palazzo, is seen in a sliver. And then I can't answer this honestly, but the funny thing is then you get to like that. That's either because architects are just very accommodating and you make the best of any situation, or else it's because the partial achievement provokes you more or makes you think of something else. And so we thought of this idea of making a curved wall in this little sliver space, which would go this way in plan, and we would go this way with the building. So we spanned the building its full 22 meters on a single concrete arch, and all of this weight is coming down onto 2 points at the end. So this was what we thought we might see, and this is what you do see. But you get fond of what you do see. These guys are the boxes that the screens slide out into, so that you can subdivide the studios. The little balconies and the slots in the brick are little outside spaces for the students to have a smoke, because they spend all their day indoors away from light and aren't allowed apparently enjoy natural light. So we snuck in some spaces for them. And white Portland stone is the material from England, from the Portland stone from England, which characterizes all of the public buildings in Dublin. So up here in the studios, you get this long space, these subdividing doors, and these little balconies. And on the other side of the square, we have the white Portland face of the Gallery of Photography and its glass staircase against the wall of the Irish Film Centre. So when you're in the studio, you go up onto these little balconies, you go to the dark room, and the tutors are up there too. When you're standing in the square, you don't view the building in its facade, you view the building obliquely. And this is connected with the idea that you saw in the first sketch, that one day we hope to remove 2 floors out of this concrete frame building here and cut right through that and then make a new bridge across the River Liffey. So there'll be a connection north-south, and this building here, our building, and interior as well as externally, will be a bridging building between street and square. So its longitudinal expression maybe is more important to us with the idea of the arch. It is almost, but not quite finished. But you feel, I hope, in these pictures, you feel something of the solidity of the solidity of the form of the project, which is completely to do with the peculiarities of the program as described to us. We've had to fight for every single window, and the clients always walk into this room every time they walk in, and they say, "You haven't blocked that window up yet. It's the only window on the top 3 floors of the building," and it's a hazard apparently. This is a portrait studio. We thought natural light in the portrait studio would be okay. On the other side of the square, and in a completely different arrangement, because this building is purpose designed for its use as a gallery of contemporary photography, you have this little white stone mask with the sliding shutter. This time, in the other building, the screens are dividing the studios and they come out through the wall. In this case, the screen is going up and down behind the zinc to open and close the window in the gallery. You don't enter the building frontally. You slide in. You slide in the side, in that door, between the stone wall and the glass tower. So you slip into it. And then you find yourself losing contact with daylight as you walk into the bookshop. You can still see out to the square, but then the window is gone, and you've lost the outside world. And then you emerge in the world of the exhibition upstairs. This giant stoneyard down here is Paul, Kyo and Rachel Chidlow's project for the stone square of Meeting House Square. And this wing on the other side that you sometimes see in the photographs is Shane O'Toole's project for a children's centre theatre that plays out onto the square. So there's 4 sides to the square. Sheila and I are facing with photography. Paul and Kyo and Rachel Chidlow are making a cafe and studios building. Shane O'Toole is making a theatre building. And all these together are intended to make a place for public performance and for organised events and casual, disorganised use in the centre of Dublin. So sort of breathing space for Dublin culture. We got very interested in the qualities of the material and in the open texture of the base bed Portland stone, which is right through all the Dublin 18th century buildings. This is a north-facing elevation, so it never gets sunshine. So we wanted it to read light and to use that depth that's in the stone, where it leaches out and the chalkiness comes out through the stone over the years. And then to make use of the reflected image or the projected image of shadow through the glass, so that as you're looking from at night, as people move on the stairs, you see their image like in a photographic representation of the figure. Inside it's very plain materials of painted steel. And that window that you saw from outside, which is here in this little perspective, that window in this slide is shut. So they can close the window as a shutter and enclose completely the interior gallery of the photography gallery. So and then the walls of the gallery here can open out on these steel tracks, so they can subdivide, like you have here in the John Soane Museum, and so they can make twice the exhibition space out of a very tiny gallery. So they can have their local one-man shows, and they can have travelling exhibitions of much larger scale. When the window is open, that's where the screen slides up to, and it gives you a contact right out to the square. The steel bridge across is just in that sliver between the stone face and the room of the exhibition. So this last drawing on the Photography Centre is trying to show the connection, which is now, we're just now pulling out of 9 years on this block. But if you went for a walk, and if you were not looking at the 18th century or the 19th century, you can walk through 9 years of our efforts without seeing anything else from Essex Street to Dame Street. This is the 4 ways into the film centre and the 4 ways into Meeting House Square, the photography archive, the gallery of photography, the film archive, the big cinema, and the foyer and connections of the film centre itself, and the two new spaces. And just the thing of trying to make, even in the roof space, to make a sense of public space within the roof configuration of the city of Dublin. We entered the Walsall competition, which has 2 consequences. One is that you guys in Britain get a marvellous scheme from Caruso St. John. I think a brilliant project, the idea of the medieval tower or the installation of something so strong in the context of Walsall. But the consequence for us is that we're left with something that we have to get out of our system. In this project that we made for the competition, which was based on an idea of making public space. We tried to make a connection between the space of the canal and the space of the street by a kind of interlocking plan that brought the water and the public space into a sort of into an interlock, which is around which is distributed the spaces of the gallery itself. So we're making an outdoor room for public life. I don't know if there's the public life in Walsall that there is in Dublin, but it's a project. The creation of public room is a project that is on our mind. We were very interested in the section and in turning the interdependency of the plan into an interlock in the section, so that you could have move both under and without the building in the same pattern of movement as you could move within the building, and so that the emphasis in the project of openness and accessibility could be translated in the experience of the architecture. We tried to make a building that might feel as if it were a refined, reduced or refined building in itself. Anyway, congratulations to Caruso St. John, and nothing is wasted. And we're making furniture. Which is going to go into production, if we can ever make the prototype, made in plywood and steel. You buy one of these to hang on your wall, and it allows you to sit at your computer and keep your papers. And then you save up, and you buy a little one that comes to join in, where you keep the papers that you've had nowhere to put except up there. And then you wait. And then you buy this guy that has a tall cupboard for your now accumulating pile of papers, and a hinge that closes up when you're not using it. And it's all made in plywood. We worked with a joiner in the photography building, which as you saw was a sort of very much on-site stuff, so it's not all installed yet. But the working with the joiner and the development of the joint in the plywood became a really intriguing subject. And so we're now busy making working drawings for something that I'm sure is going to change the working environment of 4 or 5 Irish people. We have a new project which is it has been flirting with us for a few years. And we have some friends in the office who have even given up working with us and gone to work in other places, who we saw here tonight, who'll be glad to hear that this building is finally happening. It's a little school. We live here, and it's our local school. And they were in a bad fix, and you get talking to people, and eventually you're the architect, and then 4 years later they actually ask you to do the building. So we're making a building in a very complicated site, in a very difficult location, in a place where the Department of Education, first of all, the Department of Education said you can't put a school on the site, it's too small. The answer is there is a school on the site. It's horrible. They said, well, show us that you can do a scheme on the site. So we innocently made a proposal for a school, and then the architect in the Department of Education said, what a fantastic site. I think I'll do it myself. And so he did a project, and it went 2 years into the planning process, and he got every single objector in Dublin to finally defeat the project through the planning procedure. And then the Department of Education rang us up and said, would you like to have the school back? It's like somebody spitting in the soup, and then saying, no, you have it. And now we're involved in a consultative and difficult process of trying to explain to people why it might actually be to the advantage of the locality to have a school on this site. And so we're making a project in this wonderful situation where the 18th century houses of the terraces are intact, and their relationship to the grounds in front of them are intact. And we're trying to continue that by making a playground for the school, which will sometimes be a garden and park for the residences. And then we're making a school building to line the street, which is part of the architecture of the street. And we're making it in brick with as few windows as we can manage, to keep a hard wall to the street, but more importantly to us, to make a space in the rear for the relationship of the school with its garden. And this giant veranda, which is like the head of a carpet hoover, to draw the children right into the school at break time and spit them out at lunchtime. And we're making this building in brick and in timber and in stone. If you were able to see that slide, you'd see those things in the drawings. And this is what we're referring to as some of our semi-cooked projects. But this one is just, I think, these are the sort of intermediate sketches that we're working on now. And very shortly, this will be happening, maybe this year, we think.
Well, as John explained, we spent 9 years on that urban block in Dublin, and since then we seem to be getting projects everywhere in Ireland except Dublin, and we've been moving north, south and west around the country, and we're beginning to feel we wouldn't mind having a project in Dublin again. It's a lot of travelling, but the work that we've been doing has involved a lot of building in the landscape, or as in a case like this project, which is in Cork in the south of Ireland, in sites which are on the edge of the city and have some of the conditions of landscape and some urban relationships also. This project is for University College in Cork, and the city of Cork, it's quite a small city of about 120,000 people, built on the River Lee, which goes out. The sea is a few miles down that way to the south, or in fact to the southwest. And the city is very beautiful. I think it's quite small and has a very strong sense of topography. A lot of the in the centre and in the suburbs, there are very steep hills leading on the river banks, the river valleys, which in an aerial photograph don't show very strongly. But the site we're working on is here, which is hard to see in focus. There's a long red building, which is an existing building, which is on our site there, and the university is located over here, the existing campus. And the university has expanded greatly in the last 5 or 10 years, and they literally have no more space for expansion of students. So after much thought and worrying, they've bought this site on the north side of the city, which is apparently politically very important. There's a lot of pressure in the city to have a third level educational institution on the north side. And also, as in many cities in Ireland, and I'm sure elsewhere, there are a lot of large institutions built in the 19th century which have become redundant because their use is no longer relevant. And in the case of this and one of the other projects that I'm going to show you, they're at a they're very topical at the moment because they're religious institutions which have a very melancholy and slightly disturbing past, and people are becoming more and more aware of what went on in these buildings when they were occupied. On the right is a sort of sketch study model of this urban context, showing the existing campus here, the orange being the main quadrangle, and the buildings we're working on here, which are known as the Good Shepherd Convent, which is a very long range of brick buildings. And this model is about looking at the visual relationship between the existing university and this campus, which is very strong, that when you're in one you can see the other very strongly, across this double valley here where the river has split into two streams. Can this be focused? The Good Shepherd Convent operated as a sort of tripartite institution. The central building here was known as the convent, which I presume the nuns lived in. On the left, the building known as the home, where basically what seems to be what were described as fallen women, women who either became pregnant or were prostitutes, were taken from the streets in some collaboration between the nuns and the state, and were brought to live in this building and in many other buildings like this. And they worked usually in laundries, and at the back of this building there are a huge number of outbuildings, sheds, laundries, ironing rooms, where these women worked for the length of their lives. And on the right-hand side is the orphanage, where the children of the unmarried mothers were brought up. And the nuns have sold this building in the last few years to the university, and they also sold the land, which is extending up to here, slightly out of the picture, and then down this piece of land. And we've been asked to look at the buildings and the land and to make proposal for an extension of the university facilities into this site, with a suggestion of 3 university departments that would move here, but also with the client asking us really how we could transform this place into an appropriate environment for an educational institution, which we found a very interesting and kind of difficult challenge. On the right is a model we've made which shows what we're retaining of the existing buildings, which is really the three main buildings I've pointed out here, which are listed buildings by an architect called George Ashland, and a chapel at the back of the convent, and one chimney. There are 2 large chimneys which related to the laundry and other work areas at the back. And we have decided to retain the main one, which is quite a fine piece of brickwork, as a kind of memory or landmark to the former use of the building. And we're removing all the linking blocks the nuns built and various other stuff at the back. What we found looking at the building is that on the one hand it looks very simple. When you see it in the front, it's 3 frontal buildings lined up. But when you go into it, you become completely lost very quickly. And because of the way that they have built additional buildings, they've built new structures at the back. And it almost feels like it was an intentional idea of the institution that the people who were there, the penitents or the inmates, wouldn't have a clear relationship with the building they were in. They entered, as far as we know, the women were brought in the back, in through these sheds into the building, and in fact arrived on a landing halfway up a staircase. So there was a sense that the nuns who ran the institution, came in the front door and understood it and were able to clearly relate to the buildings, but that the people who were living there in a slightly less free way were actually trapped in a kind of labyrinth. And that was one of the reasons why we felt we had to remove the appendages and strip the building back to its kind of basic form. And this whole issue of the transformation of institutions has just coincidentally become a major thing with us, because we've got 2 projects at the moment which are working on buildings which have some kind of melancholy history. And we found with the clients and among ourselves and other architects, it's brought up a lot of very interesting discussion about the reuse of buildings and the significance of the past of a building. And I suppose what we intend in this and in our other project in Connemara is to transform the institution, but not to completely wipe out its past, so that in some way it's like a sense of what went on there has got to be kept in the future. What we're proposing is to to retain the three buildings here. And behind those buildings, there's a very interesting piece of the site which is quite steeply stepping up to a big retaining stone wall all along the back here. So we're making a series of new spaces and buildings at the back of these, which will be the kind of core buildings or the starting point of the new university or new section of university. So we're opening up entrances between the existing buildings into these new spaces and into the new buildings we're making. And then we're making a series of gardens using the terracing on the site with a forecourt here and stepping gardens down to buildings which define the southern boundary of the site here, and which the model on the right shows some sense of the topography, which if you're in these buildings here, you would be able to see over the roof of these ones because of the steepness of the slope. And then we're making a series of new spaces and buildings on this side as part of this. These are a kind of framework development plan that we've made for the whole site, which is to do with the future, a projection of how the buildings and lands would be used in the future. And then we started looking a little more closely at the buildings that are, we're now working on a planning application for this part here, which really are the buildings which are in direct relationship with the existing buildings on the site. And the model on the right here is a segment of just this part here, which is the Social Studies and Adult Education Department for the university, where we're looking at ways of making new buildings at the back of the site, making a kind of wall, and then having intersecting, in this case, a lecture theatre which spans between the old and the new and gives a space underneath. And we found that the existing buildings have very fine spaces of a certain scale, but they're all quite big. So our new buildings tend to have small rooms and offices, and the existing buildings have the larger spaces for teaching. And then we make bridges and ramps that connect those, the two buildings. The photograph on the left gives a sense of, it's taken from the back looking down towards the river. And you can see the three buildings that we're retaining, which are there, and here. And then you can get a sense of the extent of the aggregation of other forms which took place shortly after the buildings were originally built, with the laundry and ironing rooms here, and other workrooms and bakeries on this side. And this is the area where we're making a series of new spaces in here and over here. On the right is the small model showing the existing large rooms in the building here, our new building at the back with small-scale offices, and then the lecture theatre which spans between with ramps and bridges. In the west of Ireland, sort of almost simultaneously, we're working on another. This one was a former industrial school, also built in the 19th century, which was a place where boys who were children, I suppose it's like a children's prison, where boys who were found guilty of various crimes or misdemeanours were sent for different periods of time. And it's in an incredibly remote location in Connemara, very, very beautiful landscape. Seen in the photograph on the right, this mountain is directly behind the building to the side here, which is a really dramatic contrast between the beauty of the landscape and the rigidity and authoritarian character of the existing building, which is the Christian Brothers Reform School. And this building has, in the last 10 years, been taken over by a local community group called Connemara West, who bought it without really knowing what they would do with it when the brothers sold it. And they have gradually built up a series of uses in it, the main one being a furniture college, which they started as a course to give local young people who had no prospect of jobs some kind of skill, and it's gradually developed into a very good third-level furniture design and making course. But the building, at the same time, they occupy the building for the college, but they also keep their community activities. So there's a library in the building, which is the community library and the college library. There's a radio station. There are other uses which intersect between the community and the college. And they, having been occupying the building for some time and now finding they don't have enough space for the college, have asked us to look at it and to make proposals for its extension and transformation. The drawing is probably a bit invisible, but the model on the right shows the existing building here, which is set back from the village street is here. The building is set back with a kind of imposing direct relationship. And as in the last photograph, you may have seen a very axial relationship to a porch from the road. And we, again, there was the people had already had a lot of discussion locally about whether the building should be demolished, whether it should be retained, whether, what the correct thing to do with these buildings whose history is dubious and creates a lot of bad feeling in people who spent their youth there, who lived there. But the locals felt very strongly that they had taken over the building and they had introduced a new spirit in its use, and they wanted the buildings now to undergo some kind of transformation to reflect that. And we found that just looking at the landscape and thinking about simple things like how you enter the building seemed very important. And we're proposing a new entrance that, instead of leading directly to the porch in the front, is a kind of carving road that brings you through the site to a new entrance in the end bay here. And the proposal was to extend their existing facilities. They want to have a furniture design centre, which is like a study centre for prototyping different kinds of furniture and woods, and an information centre for the furniture industry. And they want some sports facilities and to extend the student rooms and facilities. So we made a decision to when you come in the entrance to go down into a lower area of the site here with all of the heavy traffic, the deliveries, the service lorries and things that are bringing timber in and out to the school machine hall here, new machine hall for the school, and to the furniture design centre here at a low level. So because of the contours on the site, we could bring people in down there, and then to bring pedestrians and cyclists and cars in here up to the main entrance to the building. A lot of the things that we're doing here are to do with, in relation to the existing buildings, again, there's an element of listing that the local planning office don't want the buildings changed in a major way. And we found that sometimes with existing buildings like this, that very small changes are very important. And for example, we looked at the windows and found that all the window sills were above head height. They were at sort of 1.8 metre sills in every room in the building. So on the ground floor, we proposed to extend the windows downwards by adding a little bay section so that people would have a view out of the building. And they'd been working there for 4 or 5 years, and they didn't really know, they had never noticed that they couldn't see out the window. We came in and we said, how can you manage working in this building? There's no view out. And they said, well, no, they'd never noticed this. So we're proposing here to extend the windows downwards by inserting a kind of timber bay box, which would also be where the natural ventilation and opening part of the window would be, and give you a kind of workspace for your desk inside. And then also by working with the existing external wall, that we're inserting wooden porches and trying to work between the surface of the existing and the insertion of new elements. Materials were very important here, and because of the furniture college and the research centre, we wanted to use as much timber as we could in relation to the harder materials that are already in the building. So we're making a sports hall using laminated timber beams, which hopefully some of which can be fabricated or worked on within the school in their workshops. And then we're using a timber structure in the machine hall here, and a timber sort of courtyard cloister, which is, the building has a kind of plan at the moment where there are no corridors, you walk from room to room. So we're attaching a timber cloister around the L shape of the existing building, which connects all the parts without breaking up the existing rooms, and allows the new building over here, which is the machine shed, also to be connected in this kind of zigzag shape with fire escape stairs on the ends here and here. And then we're proposing a new library and cafe in this area, and making what was a kind of exercise yard into a more pleasant garden for students. The furniture design centre and research building is a small separate building, which has a timber tower, which is the water tower, and lift and stairs here, and otherwise uses coloured render and some stone for a special. This building is here. As you enter the site, you drive past the Furniture Design Centre to the old building here. And in a way, placing a building here in front of the existing building was very important in terms of claiming the land in front of the site for the people in the village, and a sense that the Christian Brothers occupied this part of the site here, and that they were now taking over the field in front, and by putting this building with a public meeting room for lectures and local community meetings here in the foreground would really give a sense of changing the relationship of the institution to the village. And these drawings, this drawing are about the materials that we're using, which are a combination of timber, render and stone, and metal roofs, turned stainless steel, which we've used in other buildings, which is trying to build up a kind of language of building and then working within the shapes of the ground, sometimes digging into the ground somewhat to make a kind of rolling landscape, or using forms in the land to relate the building and the landscape. And in particular in the model here, keeping the public entry at one level and then cutting back in at the lower level to make the service, and so that the Furniture Design Centre has a public front onto the higher level and then the service entry at the back here. And those are some details of the new building. On the right is the library, and a new library on the upper level with a restaurant underneath, looking into a new garden that we're making. And again, we're looking at timber construction for the trusses for the roof, and otherwise using masonry walls finished in coloured render. And this is the end of the timber cloister, which runs around the building, turns the corner and becomes a fire escape stair here, attached to the old render of the existing building. I mean, this project is at a stage now where the design is reaching a level of development close to going in for planning permission, but we're just trying to define or complete our sense of what the language of the building will be. Just up the road from that, there's another project for a community, a local arts centre. This village called Tully, also in Connemara, is a typical Irish village of one street, with, in this case, buildings only on one side. And there's a building here which is called the Teach Ceol, which means the House of Music, which is built by the same group of people, or by an offshoot of the Connemara West, for Irish traditional music and dance and performance. And there's a lot of a huge increase in interest in the whole subject of traditional music and dance, both locally and internationally. So the huge number of people come here every year, particularly in the summer, to listen to music and to get involved in dancing. And they wanted to expand this and to make a place for greater level of performance, and for people to participate, and to have an archive to do traditional music. So we found that the existing relationship of the building to the village was quite strange, that it was very isolated, and it is up a hill, and you have to enter it by driving up the road and turning off into here. So our proposal, shown in that little model, where this line here is the village street here, was to take the existing building and then to build a kind of cluster of different buildings, or housing the different functions around that, and then making a new route down into the village, so that you could walk up the village street into a forecourt and up through the new building to the existing music centre. I mean, this is a project at a very early stage, but part of the reason for looking at it is to do with the kind of plan, I suppose, is very similar to the film centre, where there's a proposal for a space in the centre, a foyer space, around which the other uses are collected in either different forms or under one roof. So the centre in this case is here, which is a solid roof with a big roof light on it. It's a grass-roofed building that you can walk up onto. And then around it there are various rooms for restaurant and bar on this side, and the main performance space here, and the archive for traditional music. And then the existing building here remains as a small performance space for dance classes. And the access will be through this forecourt, up these steps, where external performance could take place in the summer, into this space and through the building. And these sketches are an idea of the way that we were thinking about it and working on the plan relationship. And this can be seen maybe more clearly here three-dimensionally in this kind of relief model of the way that we were stepping up with the existing hill to make this sort of amphitheatre entrance, and then making a collection of spaces around this new internal space. And the relationship with the village here was quite important, and how you move and how the angles of the building relate to the street of the village as you move through. That type of plan is something we found that we've made a number of projects. These are two competitions we've done where the same, we've sort of found ourselves making the same kind of plan of making a space, and the one on the left here, which was a visitor centre for the Cliffs of Moher in the west of Ireland, we made a sort of street down the middle, which is an exhibition space and a public gathering space, which has various shops and archival rooms and performance connecting to that, and the shape related to the particular shape of the stone in the landscape on the site in relation to the very dramatic cliffs. And then on the right is a recent competition for civic offices just outside Dublin in a small town where there was an existing very beautiful medieval castle with a big bawn curtain wall surrounding it, where we made a plan to do with making a public concourse space for the local civic office where people could come in and pay their rates or talk to their representatives. And then where the various offices were related in a kind of almost casual way to that, but relating in some way to the form of the castle across the way, and also relating to the landscape, because there were two very beautiful trees on this site here and here, and the building in a way sort of sidesteps around those trees and relates to them in terms of how it uses the site. And that way of thinking about how a building might work on a site which is not particularly urban but which is more open, it was very important in the Blackwood Golf Centre, which we finished in 1994, early 95, which is in an amazing landscape in Northern Ireland, an old, mature landscape of an estate of a big house. And the model on the left here shows just about an existing band of enormous mature trees. And we were given the site with this big band of trees, and marked on the ground of our map was a strong curved form, which was the golf driving range, which had been located by the golf course architect as a fix on the site plan. So we had to work with this curve, which is there on the map, as a driving range where people all go in and hit golf balls into the distance. So we used that and the landscape of the parkland of trees, and the fact that this was a gently sloping hill from here down to the building, as a way of setting up a few kind of defining elements, one being the curve, the slope, and then the trees defining it. These are some of the models we made at the time. This was a competition of the competition entry. And this model we made out of a sort of solid block of wood, because we had already felt very strongly that we wanted to use wood in the building. I think mainly in relation to trying to think about a golf building as being to do with like cricket pavilions or tennis pavilions, and trying to think of a kind of ethos that a sports building might have, which was different from what we felt most golf clubs had, which was more to do with thick carpets and brass-framed portraits of the captain, which was not what was wanted here. The client wanted a building which was, as she described, democratic, open and welcoming, and was to be for everyone. It was an open golf building, it wasn't a club. So that was very important in terms of the character of the building and how it might work. So we took the curve of the driving range and really used that as a way of setting off a series of elements which were to house the other functions of bar and restaurant, changing facilities and shops and offices. And then we worked with fairly detailed drawings and models to develop a sense of how we would structure the landscape. We've made basically a main outdoor space here, which we described as a courtyard or esplanade, which is between the driving range and the main part of the building, and which mediates between the indoor and outdoor activities. And this space is kind of critical to how you understand the building, and it uses the section of the land which comes down did come down as a slight hill. We have used to make this step where the driving range is set down into a cutting, which goes off, then the landscape slopes down that way, so that you could have the entrance here through a porch into a reception hall, out into this courtyard, and then you could overlook the driving range or look across the roof of it out to the landscape. So the building is about arriving from a car park up here through this porch into the reception hall, from which you can go to bars and restaurants, the changing rooms and the golf shop. And then this is the courtyard space, the external space, which is the kind of defining space in the building between the driving range and then the bridge to the first tee for golfers, which is at the end of the space going that way. We were interested again in the materials and in the relationship of the building and the landscape. We looked at a lot of traditional Irish agricultural buildings, which are very often red painted corrugated iron and have very strong forms in the landscape. And we wanted to kind of relate to that tradition, but also to use a different kind of palette of materials and obviously make something more permanent than a shed, a farm shed. So the main materials that we used were the red render, which was a self-coloured render which we imported from Italy, which has this colour which is like the rural agricultural buildings. And then we used western red cedar for the wooden elements, which is a naturally weathering material, so that it starts as a kind of very warm yellow colour but gradually becomes more and more grey and silvery and has a sort of well, I think the idea of a building that develops a pattern and changes in time seemed very important, that you would use a material that has its own character, and the cedar has a preservative that comes out when it's wet, which gradually develops a kind of powdery coating. And I suppose this drawing, which is an elevation and section, is also about how we were using the landscape, cutting the building into the land here where the entrance is here, stepping down there where there are service rooms underneath here with the what was originally the golf shop there, later became a reception room, with the bar and restaurant at the end facing out to the golf, to the 18th green. And then this is the other half of that same drawing, showing at the end of the building where there's the bridge to the golf from the courtyard or terrace, with this little building which changed use about 4 times during the course of construction, but which is now sort of greenkeeper's shed underneath for repairing golf clubs and things, and as an office and security building overhead. On the right you see the cedar before it started to weather, and this turn-coated steel which we've used as the metal for the roofs in the building, which also is a material which changes and weathers and develops this kind of pewter-like quality. And then pulling back the building in the landscape as it's seen with the trees in the distance, you can see that it's actually changed a lot now. The wood has gone almost completely grey and it looks quite different, and probably in a way more the way we would intend it. The red colour was very important, that would be strong, and I think we always wanted the wood to be more like a natural material. And in the beginning the building seemed a bit bright when it was built. And then at the west end is the bar above and the restaurant below, looking out over the golf, with a big ramp down from the terrace where people can either go out to golf or come back from the 18th green. They come back this way and up this ramp straight into the bar terrace here, or back into the changing rooms up there. And we had an idea about the lightweight frame on the outside here holding up this roof, which is a shaded terrace for people in the bar. And then that there's the solid elements of the masonry behind that with the timber infill for the bar. And you can see here the frame construction of that as it was on site, and the almost completed on the right. The entrance to the building is through a kind of external porch, which is an outdoor room. And we've used a wood block floor here, which is a material which is very nice. It's end grain timber, which you can walk on with golf studs, and it develops little holes, but the wood doesn't break down. So it's kind of golf friendly without being. We found that most golf clubs have a spike-proof carpets, which are really horrible and don't have any kind of material quality. And the clients were really good here. We talked to them a lot about it, and they were prepared to try out different things in the interest of the character of the building. So the entrance gate is a big steel gate which can close across this external porch when the building is closed, or else it's on a wheel on a track here. So when it's open, it has the menu for the restaurant here and the door. So you look at the menu and nip in the restaurant door. And then the reception hall, which is the main space where you pay, where all the golfers come to pay here at the pay desk and find out information. And there's a series of little bay windows which are like waiting points where you can have coffee and wait for your friends and look out at people moving by in the courtyard. And the courtyard itself with the way through from the reception room here. And the drawing on the right shows how we were trying to cut the landscape down to the way into the driving range here, using the same red material to give a kind of layering of walls in the land, which is there in the photograph, the way down to the golf, with railway sleepers for the steps and marking out the courtyard into sections. It shows the materials, how they work together, the red, the render and the cedar. Oh, sorry, I pushed the wrong one. Sorry, just go back one. Oh no, sorry, I did the wrong one. Thought it was the other way around. Well, maybe we've lost the other one. This is, in fact, the last picture. It's the view as you return from as you go out to the golf or return from the bridge, looking from the woods back into the building, where the wood of the trees sort of merges with the wood of the building. And as you move from the trees into the building, it gets more heavy and more masonry. And I suppose this condensed image of it from one end summarises for us something about the way we wanted the materials and the spaces and the section of the land to work between the indoor and outdoor spaces. That's all. Thank you.
So I'm sure Sheila and John will take some questions from the floor. Maybe while people are gathering their thoughts, I mentioned at the beginning this very strong use of color in your work, and you also referred to the red and the connection with the local buildings, in a sense. But it seems to me that the use of color somehow plays even a more significant role in your work beyond its kind of associations to local conditions and farmhouses and so on. I wonder whether you can tell us something about the status of color in your projects, in your work.
Well, I think that I just want to say one thing that there's an article in this week's RIBA journal
About that?
which says that the group of architects with whom we are associated are known by the collective title the Whites. And first of all, that's an invention of the RIBA journal. I don't know that anyone has ever called any of us the Whites. And secondly, it's a touching. I mean, it's a touching inaccuracy, I suppose. We think a lot about the presence of the building, of the actual resonant presence of the building. And our only interest in colour is in the material that the colour is a part of. We have no colour schemes and no paint, hardly any, in any project. So our interest, I mean, when we put on that yellow plaster or the blue or the red, you know, they come out of the bag. They look like ground when you have them in the bag. And then you put it on, I remember with the blue cobalt, because it was such a tight budget. The blue comes in tiny packets of blue. And the plasterer puts it all on the wall, and it's the bluest thing you've ever seen, like a packet of Gitan. And then by evening, the wall is snow white, absolutely white. And then the next day, he puts another coat on, and we are absolutely delighted. And then by evening, it's completely white. So then we just got totally fed up and stopped going to the site, and lost confidence, I have to say. And the builder said to us, well, if you went on your holidays, you wouldn't expect to get a suntan on the first day. And he just kept going. He kept going every day and working, you know, keeping it wet, keeping going. And we learned about plastering from the plasterer. And the blue is the blue is as much, is what's coming out through the plaster, but it's part of the wall. And what we're trying to do with the colour, it's one thing is plaster, but it's also with the white stone and the chalky red brick in the photography building, and even in the metal, is to use the materials for the materials make a demand of you to look at them or to feel them. They are part of the resonant presence of the building. So I don't know if we don't have colour really.
It's difficult because The clients always say that buildings are too white. Probably the only paint we ever use is white paint. So, because we always think rooms should be painted white, if they're painted, obviously you start by doing them white. If there's a problem, you might think of using another colour. But so I think that, in fact, we often think that inside buildings, particularly, where if it is a plastered, painted wall, that it would usually be white. But I think that there's a thing we didn't really mention, which I suppose is about the thing about the emotions that buildings provoke. And I think it's something we feel is really important in architecture, and something we think about a lot. And I suppose it came about through maybe doing projects which took a long time, very intimately involved with clients like the Film Centre, where you're thinking about trying to create an atmosphere appropriate to a particular activity or a particular art or something, and also then dealing with an existing building which has its own overlay of that kind of thing. And maybe the colour thing to some extent comes out of that, wanting to create a certain, thinking about the psychology of buildings, or wanting to create a certain response in people of some kind. I don't know, it's difficult. We find, I think that in the Irish landscape there are a lot of buildings which are quite strongly coloured, and it is a sort of natural thing to do, that buildings have a sense of colour, or either rendered buildings, which is quite common, coloured rendered buildings, or the corrugated painted buildings.
I might just take up what you used. I think you used the word psychology, and this is just an impression I have that your use of colour as texture, texture as colour, seems to be something to do with a way of approaching the design through a series of local incidents that draw you through things. And beginning with the Temple Bar, which I have personally visited, I was struck by there's an elementary distinction between designing by cutting through existing fabric as opposed to freestanding building in a landscape. Yet, when you've gone to the west of Ireland, you've then created your own interiors, your own sort of ensembles. You've spoken about interior streets and interior courtyards, and I got the sense that you were using colour and texture to design not through a sort of sense of overall gestalt, but through an appeal to psychological episodes at each turn or juncture in the building.
I think that probably is true. I suppose what we would like is to have in a way both, to feel that there is a kind of overall order to something that's there, but that maybe some people going to visit a building may never be conscious of what the rigorous organising principle of it is, but they would experience it more, as you say, as a series of episodes or of events that you move through. I think that's something that maybe wasn't in some of the work we did earlier, but is more coming. Maybe to do with the kind of work we have now, and particularly working with these institutions and trying. It forces the issue very much when you're working with quite authoritarian former institutions, of how people experience buildings, what their reaction to them is, how they. And maybe the colour, even in Connemara, we felt the building now that's there is painted a kind of grim beige colour, and we felt it was very important that somehow that its very surface would be transformed when the building is changed, and that people that maybe sort of quite subtle things can change people's perception of how they see how a building is or how they're using it. But it is, it just happened to be going through a phase of doing a lot of work where that issue is very much to the fore.
I'd like to know, looking at the West Coast Bar and the buildings and the building in the golf club, there's starting to be a kind of vocabulary you're starting to use. How does that work with the scale of the buildings? The scale is very interesting, and the sort of additive quality of the buildings, the additive buildings, often with different vocabularies. How does it work in relation to the scale? Because
you mean in terms of a singular presence? You know, if you fly over the landscape of the Netherlands, you see it from the air, the way it is. And when we look at a Dutch project, we get that sense from the project. If you flew over the landscape of Ireland, you would find a tangle of hedges and lanes and a weave, it's a complicated form. And we are trying, it's not a conscious association we're trying to make, but we're aware that as soon as we set something up, we try and counterpoint it or offset it or introduce its opposite. And we're interested in the building developing its own conversation, which will charge the place with a sense of life or with a sense of intensity, and not singularity. Now, in the case of the institutional buildings, the two we're dealing with, the former laundry home and the former prison reform school, they're completely set up on the notions of certainty and centre and singularity. And our interpretation of what we've been asked to do is to transform that reading into another reading, which includes the existing. We're not trying to put contrasting or elementally sort of sharply contrasting elements together between new and old. We're trying to discuss or with the fabric of the building, trying to interact with the fabric of the building to make a new thing, which is not the old plus the new, but a kind of a third reading. We have a nervousness about whether you're left with any building at all at the end of that process. And certainly, if you went to Blackwood, you would probably find it's a very small building with about 4 rooms in it. And you know, it's not big. It's not. And I think in the Cork project that we're working on now, where it's much larger scale, and we have rooms that are, you know, we have a library that's 23 meters across, or we have rooms of the dimensions of which we have never worked with before. We're conscious of having to have a much more first principle clarity about the reading of the space. So I think it's different to do with the projects.
But particularly the West Coast, the music school building, you know, that's going to be amazing, isn't it? Because of the austerity, the austereness of the landscape, you know, the closeness of the Atlantic, one presumes.
Yeah, it's right on the coast.
That idea of the internalising of, and presumably in the Clanderboy schemes, one also feels that.